The ruling of the Supreme Court evokes a sense of déjà vu. It is obviously one of the most controversial cases the Supreme Court has seen in a while. Counsel for Emeka Ihedioha, Kanu Agabi, asked the court to set aside its judgment of January the 14th, 2020 on the grounds that it is a nullity. However, counsel to Senator Hope Uzodinma counters that the court lacks the jurisdiction to hear the case. Delivering the majority ruling, Justice Kayode Ariwola points out that asking the Supreme Court to set aside its ruling is asking it to sit in appeal over its own decisions, which he says violates the 1999 Constitution. According to him, granting the request will open the floodgates to endless litigation. He says the verdict of the Supreme Court is a finality. Lawyers are divided on the precedent set by the ruling.
This is injustice at its peak. This injustice is indescribably indecipherable. I cannot decipher it. I cannot. What does the Supreme Court that they cannot overrule their own judgment? When it is reached in error, when it's reached parum concurium, when there are conflicting judgments.
Today, Supreme Court has affirmed its decision that Hope Uzodinma was legitimately elected the governor of Imo State. It has refused the application to set aside its judgment as an abuse of court process.
However, in the dissenting ruling, Justice Santos Mweze notes that the votes which were used to declare Hope Uzodinma winner were in excess of the accredited votes for the election. He then set aside the judgment of the Supreme Court of the 14th of January 2020 as a nullity. He reasons that the court was misled in declaring Hope Uzodinma as governor and orders his removal from office. He holds that a judgment can be set aside. In his words, a judgment or order can be set aside on the merits. This court has the power to overrule itself and has done so in the past, can revisit any decision not in accordance with justice. This court has a duty of redeeming its image. It is against this background that the finality of the court cannot extinguish the right of any person.
The importance of today's decision goes to show the independence of each of the justices of the Supreme Court. The fact that the decision was 6-1 shows that each justice of the Supreme Court has his independent mind to determine an issue before the Supreme Court. The fact that 6 other justices stood on one way does not stop the other justices from dissenting from the decision of the others.
The court, however, held that all parties in the case should bear their individual costs. Chima Nwankwo, Arise News.
All right, joining us now from our Lagos studios, Emeka Nwadioke, and from our Abuja studios, Patrice Akwara, who was present during yesterday's court proceedings. Both men are legal practitioners. It's a pleasure having you here. Let us start this way. I want to start from the dissenting judge in this case. He made a very cogent point, and that's talking about Justice Oweze, made a very cogent point that the call vote, and I mean the vote that they said, okay, this man got to be able to call the election in his favor, was more than the vote cast. And he talked about that very strongly. I mean, what did he see that the other judges sitting did not see? Was it just hedged in status quo that, oh, the Supreme Court cannot rule over itself? Or what did he see?
Yeah, thank you. You know, this is one judgment that the Supreme Court will look at for a very long time and, you know, begin to wonder whether, you know, all is well. You know, because just like you said, even from the initial judgment that gave victory to Hope Uzodinma, you know, there's that controversy that about almost 100,000 votes, or 92,000 votes thereabout, were added to Hope Uzodinma to actually make him to emerge. And but you now see Justice Mweze saying that that those votes were more or less a product of fraud, because he specifically said that Governor Uzodinma, you know, admitted at the tribunal that he more or less hijacked the documents, probably rewrote the papers, and now that is probably the same result he is presenting to the Supreme Court to validate him as the properly elected governor. So obviously you see that controversy, even though some people have said that, you know, with the volume of work that the Supreme Court needed to do in a very short time to compute those figures, it was virtually humanly impossible for them to actually do a very neat job of it. And having now more or less, you know, got to where they got, then, of course, the technical issues of they not being able to overrule themselves because they can only do that in very narrow window and instances. So that's probably where we are today.
I want to get to Patrice Akwara in Abuja as regards. Patrice, you were in court, and you had talked about this before now. What was the read of that judgment yesterday?
Basically nothing different from what I've been saying differently, because like I said, the Supreme Court refused to enter into rehearing the appeal, because the substance of most of the things that was brought before the Supreme Court yesterday was couched surreptitiously in such a manner as to make it look like a review under Order 8, Rule 16. But functionally speaking, it was just like they were inviting the Supreme Court to rehear the appeal. And the Supreme Court, in their wisdom, dwelt on their power conferred on them by the Constitution, and clearly stated that they didn't have such powers to rehear the appeal. There was a particular statement made by the person the justice who read the lead judgment. He said, the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court lacks jurisdiction, it has no inherent jurisdiction. If it lacks jurisdiction to do a particular thing, it cannot confer on itself a manufactured inherent jurisdiction, because that would be just legislating, and Supreme Court does not make any legislation. So my read of the judgment is that the Supreme Court did not want to go into maybe looking at this or that, looking at the matter as if it was rehearing it, you know, rehearing the appeal. The Supreme Court dwelt extensively, you know, on whether they have the powers to sit on appeal over their judgment. So they refused to rehear the merits of most of the things that was brought there, because they were of the opinion that the issues that they canvassed ought to have been canvassed at the level of the tribunal and at the level of the Court of Appeal. And failure to do so is patently incurable, as in very fatal to whatever they wanted to do.
But Patrice Akwara, this wasn't dismissed on the grounds of merit, but that of jurisdiction and competence. But let me ask you, because it is self-evident that the numbers which was used to declare Hope Uzodinma as governor was higher than the accredited votes in the election. And it was reiterated by the dissenting justice, Unweze, yesterday. So, given the notion of finality of the Supreme Court, as you have also reiterated now, is it better to preserve an error than to correct it? Because it seems that in this case, the Supreme Court might have preserved an error instead of correcting it.
It's funny. You know, what well, with due respect to Justice Chima Nweze, what he said appeared to be like rehearing his own, some of the things he read in his dissenting judgment, as I was listening to him yesterday in the court, appear as if he wanted to reopen the matter, to rehear it. But his colleagues didn't even, just like you said, his colleagues didn't even want to go into the merit. But if you read the judgment, the initial judgment of the Court of Appeal, the issue, the very string of saying that the accredited voters were less than the votes than the total votes cast. The Supreme Court addressed it in their judgment. The thing is that most people have not read that judgment. I was of that opinion initially when I appeared there, but when they now released the judgment and the ratio through which they reached that judgment, I found out that if Hope Uzodinma said that the data, the whole data of accredited voters, voters cast, voters, that is to say, the votes that were a nullity on account of maybe double voting,
voided votes,
the votes allotted to each of the parties. By the time you bring those data in, it will increase the number of accredited voters. Exclusion of this data, of this whole data in those result sheets, will make it appear as if the number of accredited voters were less than the total number of voters. That's exactly what the Supreme Court said. So they even refused yesterday to enter into reconsidering all those things, because I believe that the 6 justices that gave the majority judgment had believed that they had dispensed with that issue. They didn't even mention it, because all you need to do is to go back and read the judgment to see that if you bring in all the data in the result sheet of the allegedly excluded booths as pleaded by Hope Uzodinma, if you bring it in, it will now inflate the number of the number of accredited voters to now make it reasonable that these were the total number of voters. But people had continued to make it look as if the total number of voters were less, the total number of voters were accredited voters was less than the total number of voters. So that is the issue. That's the issue here.
Okay, I'd like to bring it back to our Lagos studio here, Mr. Nwadioke. Now, the recurring themes here seems to be the finality of the judgment of the Supreme Court, as well as the fact that litigation must end. Now, looking at the judgments that we saw in Bayelsa State, as well as Imo State yesterday, and also holding our breath for the 14th, for the judgment in Zamfara, shouldn't we be seeing a withdrawal of this petition, seeing that this is a recurring theme of the finality of the judgment of the Supreme Court? We can start with you. When we come back from the break, we'll go back to our Abuja studios.
Yes, that's the jurisprudence, to the effect that, yes, litigation has to end. And it's not in doubt that the Supreme Court remains the final court in the land. And
okay, I'm going to have to interrupt you here. We'll continue after this break. You're still watching The Morning Show. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Morning Show here on Arise News. We're still joined in our Lagos studios by Emeka Nwadioke and in our Abuja studios by Mr. Patrice Akwara, discussing, of course, the Imo State Supreme Court's verdict yesterday. Now, before we take it back to the train of thoughts that Mr. Patrick has spoken about, those votes, I'm curious to know what your take is on the fact that we are still seeing people sending in petitions when the Supreme Court is being very adamant on the fact that litigation must end and that their verdict is final. Shouldn't we be seeing more withdrawals from petitions like this?
Anyway, you recall that many of these petitions or, requests for review have been filed, prior to the Bayelsa judgment, where the Supreme Court, of course, was very emphatic that it remains the last court in the land. So, and again, lawyers, they will always, some of them actually bring these applications, believing strongly that probably they have a case. Yes, so you can't really rule out the fact that, yes, they think there's a legal issue to be trashed out here. So to that extent, you give them the benefit of doubt. But yes, just like you said, the finality of the Supreme Court is not in doubt. Because at any rate, people felt that maybe, just maybe, the Supreme Court may shift, especially on this Imo issue. And it has shifted at least once, actually, by reversing itself. So at the end of the day, they also say that litigation is a gamble. So people can always take a shot and whatever they get.
Mr. Patrice Akwara, do you have any response to this?
Well, our colleague guest over there in Lagos has said it all. The Supreme Court had to yesterday maintain the finality of Supreme Court in matters arising from all the levels of the judiciary. There's nothing really much to add to it other than that.
Okay, real quickly, I just want to take you on the mathematics you cited earlier on. I wasn't comfortable with the mathematics. For mathematics is the fact that your illusion is just in some ways it didn't take into cognizance all this factor you posed. And while you were speaking, Emeka Nwadioke here wanted to challenge that. So I'll let him challenge that. Then we'll go back to you and we'll also challenge that mathematics. What's your challenge on that?
It's not entirely a challenge, but probably to say that when you look at the dynamics of that election, this was an election where the APC did not win a single seat in the House of Assembly. The PDP won the majority seats of maybe 13 thereabouts. AA of Nwosu won maybe 5, then ABGA. The APC never won a single seat, and this election was done same day. So, and then again, if you also look at even the issue of, the votes that were, won by, I can't say allegedly now because the Supreme Court has decided. So the votes that were accorded to Governor Uzodimma, which was in excess of 90,000. Now you also ask yourself, even if you say that, okay, when those votes are added, the accredited voters will automatically, the number of accredited voters will automatically increase. Yes, of course, that's given. But then again, we're also looking at the fact of INEC, which is the electoral body, which says that these are the accredited voters. And this has to be validated even through the card reader and all that. So obviously, if you now have additional votes, you have to give us also evidence as regards the card reader or the forms that were filled to show that these extra votes, have to come in one way or the other. And then you also ask yourself, in an election where the PDP won majority of the seats in the House, are you then saying also that if APC got 90,000 votes, PDP got 0, AA got 0, and all that? So all these dynamics have to be factored in, and probably they may even have to go to the extent of comparing it with even the quantum of votes that were got in the by the national, or rather the state assembly contestants, to equally compare it with the governorship to know whether these things tally. So,
okay, Patrice, I'd like to get your response on this, because mine is, how can just one party get gongo all the votes and the other party doesn't get anything? So please re-explain this mathematics.
I thank you for that and my, I guess, colleague over there. But I want to refer your mind to what happened in Anambra State. I will forget the year, but during Peter Obi's election, I think in Anambra then, PDP made virtually a clean sweep of all the state assembly elections, but Peter Obi won that election as, when he contested it to up to the level of the Supreme Court. So that's even a precedent to show that the voters' behavior can go anyway. It has nothing to do essentially with the party. And most of all this, politics, they say, is local. The people can decide to vote Party A in the Federal House, Party A in the State Assembly, Party B in the governorship. So these the two of them are clearly two different
Mr. Patrice Akwara, I challenge that. This was coming, but I challenge that totally.
We'll continue to have mathematics in every sphere of our lives, whether football or now.
Sorry, what do you challenge? What precisely do you challenge?
I challenge your analogy of behavioral patterns of elections.
No, but that's true. Like, I will tell you, I was part of that election. I was part of that electoral process. I will tell you, and if you also want to challenge me with precedent. In fact, in Anambra during the P2B and Ngige election, P2B, PDP, I think PDP won about 9. If they didn't win all of the seats in the State Assembly, they must have won up to 90%. But P2B won the election, won the Guba election. That's a fact. That's our history.
Mr. Patrice Akwara.
So what are you challenging?
Well, Rufai, you might have to carry all of us outside of the studio to continue your challenge. But Mr. Patrice Akwara, let me ask you, because as expected, there are divergent views from the political parties involved here. The PDP has described it as a disconcerting endorsement of electoral fraud. The APC, who is the winner in all of this, has welcomed the judgment. But let me ask you, Patrice Akwara, what do you say to those who refer to Governor Hope Uzodinma as one imposed by the Supreme Court and not duly elected by the people of Imo State? What are the likely consequences of such mindsets on our electoral process going forward?
The truth of the matter, this being a media organization, a very respected media organization, where people come to ventilate their views on national issues, those people who said what you just read out now, they are entitled to their opinion. They are entitled to that opinion. Then some other people who also feels are led by the judgment of the Supreme Court that this matter was heard on its merits right from the tribunal to the Court of Appeal and up to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court gave this judgment, and when invited to review it, stood by their previous judgment. They are also entitled to their own opinion. So suggestions don't make facts. But what I want to say in essence is that since the Supreme Court had held, I don't think there's any electoral fraud. I'm sorry, I don't think there's any judicial fraud. But if you permit me to say, since you brought this in, I said in this studio some time ago that anybody who said that Emeka Ihedioha won that election does not have any fear or respect for God, because all of us were there. The constitutional threshold for being declared a winner is that you must score the majority of votes cast and a quarter of all the votes cast in 2/3 of the LGA. That's the second leg of that provision. Emeka Ihedioha won only in where he won and where he had a quarter was only in 13, which falls short of 18, which is the 2/3 of 27. And yet INEC went on to declare him winner, which means there was a fraud. Which means that was actually his being declared initially was the electoral fraud that is supposed to be an issue. I was there live because I was a candidate of that election, so I participated actively. I'm not reporting a speech, I'm reporting a fact.
Well, you have also just accused INEC and inventing of committing electoral fraud. But let me bring it to Emeka Nwadioke because of our time. You want to respond to that? The mindset that this has been the decision of the Supreme Court.
It's not safe to allege that the Supreme Court...
the people of Imo State. What that mindset, what sort of consequences is likely to have on our electoral process going forward?
Just like he hinted, he said, there's no proof yet that maybe there's electoral judicial misfeasance. So I think the emphasis should be that this is probably technical justice, and not, otherwise substantial justice, because even the Supreme Court has, on occasion, decried technical justice. So, yes, you can say, well, was it brought within the window of, as, guaranteed by the Constitution? and all that, which was actually what Justice Nweze was saying, that you needed to go beyond the technicality to get to the substance. And if you find that this was the person who was elected by the people, you actually had to declare so. So probably going forward, we may have to see an instance where we have to amend our electoral law to probably give the Supreme Court a window to maybe review this kind of issue in instances where it merits. Even though they are worried that it may open the floodgates.
Okay. I'd like to say a very big thank you to you for coming here. Mr. Patrice Akwara, one thing is certain, we'll definitely have you here some of the times to look at these issues. I know you have a lot to ventilate and say, but thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.